Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome everybody to this evening's next installment of the Fralin Biomedical Research Institute Maury Strauss Distinguished Public Lecture Series. If Mr. Strauss were here, which unfortunately can't be, I would thank him personally. Come on in, grab a seat. We're very indebted to Mr. Strauss and his family for endowing this lecture series, and he's seriously committed to making sure we communicate with the community about exciting things going on in medicine and science, and that's what this series is part of. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to give a plug for the next talk. Next talk next month on December 15th will be by Dr. Helen Mayberg. For those of you who don't know Dr. Mayberg, she's professor of neurosurgery, neuroscience, and psychiatry, and director of the Nass Center for Advanced Circuit Therapeutics at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Medicine, National Academy of Inventors, National Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a couple other things. And she'll be talking about tuning depression circuits using deep brain stimulation, and she's doing some really exciting leading-edge stuff on affecting depression with focused stimulation in the brain of the patients that need it. All right, so without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Gurpreet Dhaliwal from the University of California at San Francisco. Dr. Dhaliwal is professor of medicine at UCSF and also at the San Francisco VA. He's also the site director of the Internal Medicine Student Clerkship Program. He's a member of the UCSF Academy of Medical Educators and the Department of Medicine Council of Master Clinicians. He did his undergraduate work in economics at Northwestern University and then stayed on there to do his medical degree at Northwestern as well. He then went on to do his internal medicine residency at UCSF and became a faculty member, going through the ranks as assistant, associate, and full professor. So he's had an illustrious career at UCSF. He's won all kinds of awards. I'm not going to read them all to you, but I think you can, by naming a couple, you'll see the central theme. He's won the Henry Hollander Teaching Award for Clinical Reasoning, the Osler Distinguished Teaching Award, the AOA Robert Glaser Distinguished Teaching Award, the Kaiser Award for Excellence in Patient Teaching. So you can see medical education is right at the heart of what he does, and as we'll hear tonight about learning clinical reasoning skills and so forth. He's a much sought-after speaker. He's written for the Wall Street Journal on their Experts in Health section. He's written for the New York Times. Article several years ago you may have seen on asking the question, can a computer outthink a doctor? Maybe we'll get the answer to that tonight, we'll see. He's done multiple podcasts. He's had over 50 visiting professorships, 140 plus publications on clinical problem solving, including JAM article on learning science, academic medicine article on clinical learning environment, article in BMJ on strategies for clinicians to advance diagnostic excellence, JAM article on next generation AI for diagnosis, and a New England Journal article on clinical problem solving. He's really a leader in the emerging field of what I think can be called diagnosis education, and I think we'll hear probably more about that. He's given presentations all over the country, all over the world on unknown diagnoses, clinical problem solving, and he's truly an expert on how doctors think. But I want to say that even though this is about clinical reasoning, and many of you in the audience are clinicians or will be soon clinicians, I think we all, coming from different areas of medicine and science and other walks of life, will take away some pearls of wisdom from Dr. Dhaliwal about how we approach problems and think about things and do clinical and cognitive reasoning. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dhaliwal.
Thank you, Dr. Friedlander, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I think I couldn't have had a more important last point, which is that this is coming from the perspective of a physician, but it covers something that we all do. We all diagnose in our life, and we all make judgments. And although diagnosis is sort of the judgment and reasoning process that I think about most, this title, Becoming a Super-Diagnostician, is not autobiographical. It's not about me. If anything, it's the opposite. It's the journey we're all on in whatever professional field we're in to make better and more refined judgment. What I'm going to share here is some insights I had from when I first started as a clinician, where I thought being great at diagnosis, that is taking the way a concern a patient has and turning it into a medical label, was all about being smart and uploading as much information as I could in my own mind, to realizing and learning that it's a much bigger, more complicated, and more fulfilling task than just that. The foundational way to think about this came to me a couple years ago. I was at a meeting of the Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine. And there was a cognitive psychologist who put this equation on the board, and he asked us to think about what this might represent. It was Gary Klein, who's an expert in the field of naturalistic decision-making, which is not studying decision-making in the laboratory, but studying decision-making in the field. Like, how does a firefighter recognize when this is a fire that you stay at versus you retreat? Or how does a nurse quickly pick up that this baby is sick even though the vital signs say otherwise? He put up this equation and then he elaborated on it. He said, if you're trying to be great in whatever field you're going into, whatever your passion is or your profession is, there are two different variables, two levers you can pull. You either can decrease the errors that you make, or you can increase the expertise that you have. And they are two sides of the coin, but they have very different approaches. If you're trying to be on a great sports team, you have to have great offense, and you also have to have great defense. If you enjoy specific sports like tennis, you might know this terminology even better, that you can't hit unforced errors, but you also have to make some really amazing winners if you really want to get ahead in it. And when we talk about optimizing our performance, the one way it falls apart compared to the sports analogy is there's no competition. We're not in competition with other doctors or nurses or scientists in any practical sense of the word. The purpose of a talk like this is just recognizing that you're always in competition only with yourself. And so what I'm going to share in this talk is 10 tips that I've accumulated, a little bit from my experience, a little bit from my mentors, and a lot from the literature on people who study people who become experts, that go beyond just being smart when I'm trying to get better at the most important judgment we make for a patient, which is what is their diagnosis. You will see it presented here as a list, but this is non-hierarchical. You don't have to pick one over the other. You don't have to do any of these things in sequence, and you never, ever will do this on a given day. Different patients, different moods, different settings call for different things. But like all ways to improve, we should consider them as a menu of options that we try to call upon and get better at in our day-to-day practice. The first, and I think the most important takeaway, is something that took a long time to dawn on me, which is that I didn't get better at being a doctor by reading stats and studies. So even though we stand on an edifice of science, we talk about evidence-based medicine, becoming a better diagnostician, the path is not paved by learning more stats and learning more studies. And when you study other fields where people become exceptional at making a diagnosis, what you learn is the foundational aspect in the practice is picking up stories. And that's why we communicate to each other in case presentations. That's why when we open up a journal, many of us gravitate toward the case report that's in there instead of the studies, all of which carry different importance. Because really every patient story is like Freytag's pyramid of how a story is structured, the way we talk to each other, which basically starts like this. We say, once upon a time. Now, we don't use that term. That's a phrase we might have liked in the childhood stories that we read, but basically every story of a patient is like that. Once upon a time, a patient was doing fine, and then something happened. So like once upon a time, a patient was doing fine at home. Then he started to get fevers, lymphadenopathy. He came to see his clinicians. They were really worried about a cancer. They sent off some tests for infectious disease. He got a CAT scan. Regional lymphadenopathy was found. And we're at this climax where cancer and infection are at the cusp. And then one day after he got that PET scan, someone did a real PET scan and took a real social history and found out that he had a cat at home. And when they discovered that he had a cat at home, they recognized that what he had wasn't lymphoma, it wasn't disseminated HIV or EBV, he had Bartonella henselae, or cat scratch disease. He was treated with doxycycline, and that's how the story ends. And he went on happily ever after. He had to give away his cat, and he subscribed to cat memes online, and that was enough for him to go on to have a happy life. And if you remember that, just compare that to how a lecture or statistics or a number would imprint on your mind, because getting better at diagnosis is a play on long-term memory. And one of the most effective ways to upload things in long-term memory are when they're housed in a story. When you look at the power of story in other fields, you'll see the exact same thing. When you study chess grandmasters, who, chess is very interesting in the expertise literature. They've sometimes been called the Drosophila of expertise research. And that's because just like many of those poor fruit flies were sacrificed so we could understand genetics, in terms of expertise, no one's been studied more than chess masters. Because you can quantify their expertise on their scale and their ranking system and the set number of judgments that they can make. But in any case, when you look at the best chess players, what you will find is that they don't read chess journals, they don't read evidence-based chess, but what they do is they read an extraordinary amount of cases, case reports in particular. They read chess games. If you look at people who are outstanding pilots, what you'll find is more number of hours in the flight simulator. If you look at people who are training for military, what you will find is a higher number of war games. The Heath brothers have a really great book called Made the Stick, and in that book, they talk about different ways that experts train. And one group of people that they highlight are copy repair people, so Xerox copy machines. And for those of us who are not mechanically inclined, and I'm not, they point out that it is an incredibly complicated machine. A copy machine has optical elements, electrical elements, chemical elements, mechanical elements. I mean, they're wildly complicated. But what they point out is the best copy repair people don't spend their time poring over repair manuals. At some amount of time, they have a sufficient amount of wisdom to go out in the field and work. And the way they take their wisdom to the next level is that they meet and chat with each other and compare notes about the problems that they face in the field together. And that's where they go from being regular diagnosticians to super-diagnosticians. And the power of a story, it's worth mentioning, isn't just that it's fun to hear stories or it's appealing to have stories. There's something else about it, which is when you hear stories in your field, your domain, the line between being in the audience and being the protagonist is blurred. After some period of time, you can start to envision yourself being part of that story. Like, what would I have done if that patient came in with fever and lymphadenopathy? And as the story is played again and again, or you retell it again and again, our mind starts to blur. Did I hear about that story, or was that me in the story? Was I in the audience, or was I the protagonist? But from the purpose of learning, it doesn't matter, because the information is there and ready to deploy when that next real-life patient comes in through the door. So the action step that I tell people with this most important and foundational tip about becoming a super-diagnostician is to get in front of as many cases as possible, to do as many reps as you can. But that's not all, because the number of cases that we have is not always determined by us. Sometimes, it's a busy day in clinic, sometimes it's a slow day in clinic, sometimes the ER is packed, sometimes the ER is crickets. You can't always control what comes in the door, but you can increase the number of cases you put yourself in front of. So for example, people who have this mindset, they take care of the patients that they're seeing, but then they look around and say, what's going on my team? And there's a very strong instinct, I have this as well, to put my head down and take care of my own patients. But like, for instance, interns and residents are often on teams with other trainees, and instead of keeping their head down, they keep their head up, and they say, what can I learn from the cases of the people around me, just on my team, the same group that I'm loosely affiliated with in terms of patient care. As they start to get the hang of learning about all the patients on their team or in the unit that day, not just the patients they're taking care of, they start to say, wait, are there more interesting cases that are around? Is there a conference where a case is being discussed? Is there a symposium that we have today? Even out of academic settings, some doctors are really inclined to get themselves in front of as many cases as possible. And they say, listen, if I have to be on a committee, I want to be on the committee that's quality improvement or peer review, where we talk about cases so I can hear more myself. And then the next action step, which I think is the most actionable now, is to get ourselves in front of all the published cases that are out there. If I gave this talk 15 or 20 years ago, that fundamentally would have meant wait for a medical journal to land in your inbox and flip through it and read through the New England Journal of Medicine. But these days, the number of ways you can get yourself in front of cases is amazing. You can find short cases on Twitter. You can go on an app called Figure One, which is basically like Instagram for docs, where you can see x-rays and EKGs and really quiz yourself. You don't go there for enjoyment, you go there for quizzing. Or you can listen to podcasts like the Clinical Problem Solvers, where they present a case in real time, and instead of listening along for enjoyment, which you listen along for practice. So the action step here is to think about what it is that you do, what are the stories in the profession you're in, and see, can I get myself in front of as many of those stories as possible, because it is the strongest play that you can make on long-term memory. The brain is wired to learn by stories, not from statistics. And if you do it just right, if you get this sense of like there's so many good stories out there, you will soon start to feel this sense of like there's really good cases around there and I need to find myself and get there. I'm missing out if I don't attend to them. The second tip comes from the world of business when people are trying to push their top performers in business, and that is that people are given stretch assignments. So stretch assignment is a pretty easy and compelling concept, which is that you take something that's at the margin of your knowledge or your skills. You're given something either by a boss or you yourself do it in order to stretch yourself. but it's actually not the way we're wired in medicine. A lot of things in medicine have to do with what is your credential, what is the legal bounds you can operate in, what's the traditional things this doctor takes care of versus that doctor takes care of. And sometimes we're bound by doing that, but I just want everyone to think of that principle and then put an asterisk next to it. I learned about this and sort of faced it after I left the confines of an academic medical center early in my career and started moonlighting at a local community hospital where things were done completely differently. I was an internist, so I'm trained by the letter of the law to take care of people 18 and above who are non-pregnant, who don't have surgical issues, and that's what all the paperwork is that I filled out for that hospital and they said I would do. And within the first couple days on shifts, I started realizing like I was taking care of a 17-year-old with pancreatitis, inflammation of the pancreas. Technically, that's less than 18. A woman who was in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy but had an asthma exacerbation, also not in my contract. A patient had a head bleed or bleeding inside the brain with a significant brain injury that I was accustomed to a neurosurgeon coming in and sort of saving the day on, but at this hospital, it was going to be me who would be responsible. And each one of those cases, my spidey sense was like, I shouldn't do this. This is not safe. I'm at the margin of my knowledge. But there was a voice sometimes of someone around me that says, you can do this. You just have to use some of the same skills you use in another place and then just learn a little bit on the margin. And by virtue of doing that again and again, not doing things that were dangerous, but doing things on the margin of my learning zone, I started to move from this concept of n of 0, I've never seen that thing, to n of 1. It's the first time I'm seeing it. And that n of 1 was all I needed to build my confidence to build on that further and further. When you think of this, one of the things that I think of is a study that was done by my colleague, Vivek Murthy. He did a study of the members of the UCSF Council of Master Clinicians, and he asked them some of the most formative things that they did that made them great diagnosticians. And a large majority of them said they took on stretch assignments. They took on early career activities that were a little outside of the bounds of what they might have called safe, but in retrospect were some of the most important things that they did. So a physician may say, like, even though I was an internist, I signed on for a job where I worked in an ED where I was seeing many, many patients. The volume was a little bit safer than I thought, but I got to it. I figured out how to take care of those patients. Or this was the first time I was ever the only doctor in the building. It was up to me or no one else, and that responsibility made me rise to the occasion. Or the description is that it's the most intense time that I ever had. It's the most intense learning that I ever had. And although we have to always operate within the bounds of safety, this is not a prescription to be reckless. When you study people who sort of push themselves to the next level, what you will see is almost always they have a penchant to recognize when they're in their comfort zone. They have the wisdom to never get into the danger zone, and they recognize this margin. They don't want to live dangerously, right? It's not like an Austin Powers moment, but they want to live in the learning zone. And so the action step is wherever it is that in your profession that you do, when you see something, I'll just give examples in medicine, like the patient that's a little bit of a organ that I'm not as comfortable with, or especially I'm not so familiar with, swipe right instead of left on that patient and bring them into your fold, because I promise you the learning that you'll do a great job, and the learning that you get will prepare you for the next time. Did I get that right? Do you swipe right? No. If you get the analogy, I want to make sure I got that just right. So action number 2 is take that and step into the learning zone. All right. The diagnosis is something that everyone does. Like I said, you are making judgments all the time. We're categorizing things all the time. And many people, when they hear about amazing diagnosticians, they think of something like House MD, or House has a TV show and he diagnoses the most challenging cases that walk in the door. But way before House ever came to the airwaves, the most amazing diagnosticians by far and away were these two brothers who didn't work in an office, but they started to work in a place like this. If you don't recognize them in their office, you may recognize them in their voice, because who I'm talking about are Tom and Ray and Click and Clack, or the Tappert brothers, who for over 40 years on National Public Radio hosted a show called Car Talk. Can I get a show of hands who here has listened to Car Talk? Marvelous. If you haven't, it was a show on NPR, and they now live on a podcast. Everyone's got a podcast, but these guys were doing podcasts before they were a thing. And what they do in their show is amazing. They take calls from all over the country, and they are diagnosticians. So people call in with all sorts of problems related to their car, the simple, the complicated, the acute, the chronic, and they are marvelous. I think there's a lot that you can learn from how they conduct themselves with people. If you listen, they're very knowledgeable, they work as a team, they love their job. You can see all these attributes that they really want. And if you listen very carefully, the thing you'll recognize, of course, is that they care much more about the person than they do about the car. But rather than extolling the entire virtue of their practice, which you really can make a case study in healthcare, the thing I want to highlight most about them and how you go on to become a super-diagnostician is that they go back and they check their work. So if you ever listen to the show regularly, you'll know they had a feature called Stump the Chumps. In that section, what they did was they went back and they said, you know, how was our work? We made a judgment. How did it go? And it might be something simple like, you know, we gave you a spark plug, you know, we told you to swap out the spark plugs, like how did that go? It might be something more complicated like, you know, the brakes were squealing, did changing the brake pads help? And they gave out all sorts of life advice, if you ever listen to that show. So whatever they gave you, they want to know. They'd be like, did you dump that worthless boyfriend like we told you to? Like whatever it was that they gave advice, they really wanted to know how it turned out. And by doing so, of course, you know, very few of us make it as public as this, but the principle is there, is that if you don't know how the story ends, then you can never make your brain better. There's no system, it can be industrial, biological, or cognitive, that doesn't get better without feedback. But it's actually surprising when you map out most of our experiences in medicine that a huge number of them end in a way that we'll never know how the story ends. Again, going back to Dr. Murthy's study, I just want to point out how many of the master clinicians he interviewed highlighted this as a key formative behavior early on in their career. So this is a person who was talking about one case. They said, we admitted a patient with pancytopenia, which is low blood counts, and therefore we thought that there was a problem with the bone marrow, which is where most of these blood cells are produced. The patient had a cardiac arrest and they died. And on autopsy, which is going and examining the body pathologically after death, there actually was no malignancy, which is what they thought they had. The surprise comes out. It says actually what she had throughout all of her coronary arteries was a fungus called aspergillus. It's a very severe and invasive fungus, and it surprised the doctors. And this alone, I think, is a remarkable thing. In terms of the power of story, this stuck with this doctor, and as I've shared it, it stuck with me as well. It's a reminder of how an infection can mimic and fake us out into thinking someone has a cancer, but they can behave in the same way. But what I want to highlight isn't just this remarkable story, there's something to be learned, but the insight that the clinician said. They said, we came pretty close to not learning from that case. What it means is if the patient didn't have an autopsy, and that could have been the doctor asking for it, the family granting it, the pathologist being available to do it, the report being studied, if any one of those steps had not fallen into place, we never would have learned, right? We would have walked around thinking that the patient died of a cancer and carried that mental model forward. And instead, this feedback was a gift that informs us going through. So the action step to think about is, what is it in your career, what is it that you do where you make judgments but you don't know how the story ends? As a doctor, I work in the emergency room, so I make a lot of short-term judgments, but I don't know how the patient's going to do. In hospital medicine, sometimes I get them through an acute phase, but I don't know how the illness is going to play out. Sometimes I cover patients on the phone and I give advice, but I tell them, please follow up with this other doctor or this person will take it from here, and I never know how the story ends. But an open loop is a recipe for disaster, or at least mediocrity in terms of informing my judgment. I'll give you an example of how, when you operate like this, how I can conflate experience with expertise. So it's easy to be experienced. I can just keep doing this for 40 years, and at the end of the 40 years, I'll be called an experienced doctor. But you can have someone who's much younger than me, who's worked for a shorter period of time, who studies the outcome of patients, and she is going to be on her path to becoming an expert doctor. So to give you an example, people come into the hospital, they have chest pain. I might do my best to make sure they're not having a heart attack or any other serious thing, and I'll say, send them on their way. They're okay, we can figure this out as an outpatient. That's a good doctor, it's the standard of care. Patients will be happy, and so will everyone else. But the colleague who I was working with, who's half my age but twice my ambition for getting better, will say, I do the same thing, she does it just as well, but then she keeps a log of all the patients that she sees, and she goes on to learn which one of them had a heart attack, which one of them saw a cardiologist, what diseases did they finally have when I said they didn't have a heart trouble, what was it? And go on and closes that loop. So I want you to do this, just think about it for a second, and I want you to turn to your neighbor and say, what is it that you do where you make a lot of judgments, you make a call on things? Do you have a system for tracking it so that your mind takes that open loop and turns it into a closed loop? Just take 60 seconds with your neighbor and say, is there anything you do where you've changed your open loop to your closed loop to refine your judgments going forward? And then we'll go on to the next tip. All right, let's come back together. We'll have another bit of pair sharing. But I want to think about this. Among the tips, I want to give this an extra gold star. If we're in the business of optimizing our judgment, there is no substitute for feedback. Feedback is very hard. It's very humbling. Some of the things that I learned on my journey as I started doing this, it was in that same job where I started getting a lot of stretch assignments, was some of the times I thought, what I need to do is I need to track the tough cases, the mystery cases, the exotic diagnoses that I'm comparing. But what I really learned was that I was making mistakes on the common stuff. I was actually misjudging whether someone had cellulitis, which is a skin infection, or whether they had venous stasis, which is poor circulation in the legs. I thought someone had a neurologic problem causing their hearing loss, but actually it was just me not being good at recognizing earwax inside their ear. Like all of the most fundamental mistakes you think you can make, the only way I made them was because I went back and I checked my work. Osler had this quote when he described this as an important thing. This is my only Osler quote I'll give, but it's one of the ones I think is both strident but true. He said, addressing a graduating class probably a century ago, he said, mercy and consideration for your other colleagues over whom you must have compassion, but none for yourself over whom you must keep an incessant watch. And if you extend that to that idea that none of us can be perfect, but all of us can be better, this is one of the many ways that we can go about doing that. Okay. I started out this talk by saying that, this is all an ode to how just being smart isn't how you become a great diagnostician. Like just uploading tons of information and scripts and data and schemas is not the path to becoming a great diagnostician, but it is the foundation. There is no way to become a diagnostician without having all that information in memory. And you can have adjuncts with our computer now, but honestly, at least in this age, there's still no substitute for having great working knowledge in your mind. But one of the things, once you adopt that mindset, which you're at risk of, and I certainly am too, is thinking on the margin. As I mentioned, I was an economist, so I think in terms of working on the margin and marginal units. And you might start to think that if knowledge is king, more is better. But every time we make a judgment about whether we're going to add knowledge, you're actually deciding not to do another important cognitive task, which is take knowledge away. So we work, there's a very interesting book, one that was recently published called Subtract, which says in general, we think, humans are wired, and certainly society is wired to think that things get better if we add things on. Add on another wing, add on another module, add on another course, add on another disease to know. It's a common bias that we have to say more is better. But one of the ways people refine their knowledge isn't adding knowledge on the margin that may have some benefit. It's unlearning knowledge that is truly detrimental. But it's an incredibly hard skill to unlearn knowledge. The knowledge that we need to unlearn oftentimes comes in an earlier phase in our career. It's foundational. It's shared mythology by everyone in the field. And it's very, very hard to extinguish. Medicine has this. I'll give examples that many of the doctors may know in this room. So many of us are taught things like if you mix alcohol and metronidazole, which is an antibiotic, you'll have a disulfiram-like reaction that will make you sick, which has been disproven, but it's taught forever. Or the idea that's very pernicious and it actually affects a lot of diagnostic testing, which is that intravenous contrast is a major, if at all, cause of kidney injury. And that pervades the entire ecosystem of medical care. You could keep learning a little more about those disorders, or you could unlearn a myth that impairs your diagnostic thinking. And it's very hard to do because oftentimes those are at the core of where we learned it. And we can give admonitions to do that. I mean, I'm really giving you one here. I want you to think about it if you can. But sometimes you're like, listen, what does this guy know? He's just telling you some tips. But I was like, if you don't want to listen from me, I want you to know that this skill and this importance of unlearning isn't something that just comes from sort of professors and doctors. This is ancient wisdom to unlearn. It's hard, it's not easy. Students sometimes resist, as you'll see in this clip, but the teacher knows sometimes that is the path to wisdom. And I'm going to show you a teacher in action here who says this message clearly and stridently despite his students' objections.
We'll never get it out now.
So certain are you? Always with your word cannot be done. You must be what I say.
Master, moving stones around is one thing. This is totally different.
No different. Only different in your mind. You must unlearn what you have learned.
All right, I'll give it a try.
No. Why not? Do. Or do not. There is no try.
I don't know if Yoda would pass muster with modern teaching standards, but he is direct. He makes his point very clear. So this notion of balancing our drive to learn and add with the skill, but the hard skill of unlearning, is one of the characteristics you see of people who are super forecasters, which is they update their knowledge rather than just accrete things on top of it. So in one more pair share exercise, turn to your neighbor and think about your profession. It could be what you're studying or what you're practicing. Is there a story that you've been told that gets carried on? And it might be on your wish list or your own personal pet peeve list, but if it was undone, if the mythology was undone, that you or the people around you would be a better practitioner. And then think about whether that can be a target. So a 60-second thought on what if you had to turn to someone, you could say you must unlearn what you have learned. All right, let's come back together. Remember, now you know how to whistle. Right? So I'm glad that this notion, like I said, sometimes, to be fair, sometimes we see it in other people, but we also have to see it in ourselves. Like, what is it who told me that story, and how should I really carry that forward in my decision-making process? Is it enhancing or is it corrupting my program? And while Yoda is a little bit on the stern side, if you want to use Elsa as more of a softer take on it, just recognize there are some things really to enhance your reasoning that you just have to let go. Okay. So it was mentioned I work at the VA hospital. It was a tremendous honor of mine. I've been a clinician there for over 20 years, 25 years if you count all my training, and I just love it there. The people we take care of, the way they served our country. If you walk in our door, there's a sign that says the price of freedom is visible here. And it reminds you sort of who's in those hospital beds and who we're serving and why. And as I've come to know many of the veterans over the years, I take care of their biomedical problems that they have and the illnesses that they do, but you also get to know them. And part of my thinking and realization, which I had many wise teachers tell me before I was too old to recognize it myself, was that getting to know them part of the story wasn't just nice, it wasn't just good manners, it was actually good medicine. So a while back I had a veteran who came in, he was a real sort of mountain man type of guy. He lived up in sort of Northern California where it gets quite cold in the winter. And he had two complaints. He had an arm problem and he had a rash on his legs. And I was like, if you work in general medicine, you oftentimes know that like musculoskeletal complaints and rashes oftentimes go undiagnosed. We sort of get in the ballpark of it's very hard to sort of get a precise label on it. I was really thrilled because in talking to him, I learned that he does electrical work and he was doing some a wall building. And so he's actually had like this spatula-like thing that he was using to get paint and other materials on there. I'm like, oh, this is definitely your arm pain. You're putting this thing on there and it hurts. So I was like, well, I got the arm thing down, the rash, so that's going to be a bit of a long shot. So I'm going to see what I can try to figure out. And I looked at a rash which he had on both of his ankles sort of wrapped around. I thought about some common things that might be causing it, like bad circulation, or maybe it was an infection, but it didn't really fit the bill. And I was really just almost like trying to buy some time. It was like running out the clock at the end of the game. I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. This is probably going to end with a steroid cream, which fixes a lot of rashes. So I thought that's where I was going to go, but I had time to kill, and I just started talking to him about what's going on. So he told me that he lives up in the sort of a remote area. He has this sort of the building that he's building it doesn't have any heating. He started putting in some of the walls, and he's chopping a lot of wood outside. So I got to know, I'm like, that's not going to help your arm too. He's like, yeah, I know, doc. I got to take a rest on that. And he's like, and I'm like, it's also freezing cold. You're doing this all outside with no heating or anything. He's like, yeah. But he's like, luckily, I picked up these socks from Costco just 2 weeks ago. And he's like, they are so warm. I've never had any socks like this before. And I said, how long you had that rash? He's like, well, about 2 weeks. I said, when did you get those socks? He's like, oh, about 2 weeks ago. And what it was unbeknownst to me, by going away from sort of this biomedical approach on the thought to rash and just getting to know him as a person, he handed me the diagnosis hand and foot, as it were. And it was very kind of him, because this was just this was a reaction to the vinyl lining in his socks. And I did get him the steroid cream. He still got that. but I also told him not to go buy your socks at Costco. Even though I'm a super fan and I have clothes from Costco, like, those socks are not yours anymore. The lesson there is actually embedded in a different thing, or a related concept, which is the idea of being social. In medicine, we teach this thing called the social history, but the way we teach it and how we phrase it is actually really impoverished, and took me a long time to recognize it. So we teach in medical school this thing called the social history, but when you think about it, it's actually embarrassing that we use the word social on it. It's a very doctor-centered word, and it has nothing to do with being social. Basically, what people do is doctors ask someone, do you smoke, drink, or use drugs? And they might ask it in a kind way, or an inquisitive way, or a direct way. But this thing constitutes the social history. But it's an odd use of the word in two ways. There's nothing social about any of those things. In fact, many people do all those things in isolation. So there's nothing social about it. And then the second is it doesn't comport with our modern usage of the word social at all. When we say social justice, when we say social determinants of health, we mean that word to have a completely different thing. But for a long time, people have been advocating for a true social history, which is what happened with that patient at the beginning when someone did the real PET scan, or what happened there when I asked that person what he'd been up to in terms of his home building in Northern California. And that is that you ask a patient-centered history. And you start to ask them not about what are these health-related habits they have, which sometimes are super important, but oftentimes are completely immaterial, and start to ask them about the world that they live in. Like, what is it that you do? Like, just the way we think of social. Like, were you in the military? Who do you live with? What do you do for an occupation? How do you spend your day? And there's two elements to think about with this. One of them is the idea that it's sort of small talk. Asking those things is very nice, but it actually comports with a very important relationship framework that we use in almost other aspects of our life, which is when you meet someone, you don't get down to business. We oftentimes have greetings, small talk, the dreaded icebreaker, whatever it is. We do something before we get down to business. And then even when we part with other people, we oftentimes end with pleasantries or small things about people's lives. It turns out that's the exact same formula for interacting with patients that works really well for two reasons. The first is if even that small talk doesn't go anywhere and it doesn't reveal diagnostic information right out of the gate, it shows that I care about you, that I care about your world that you inhabit, not sort of the biomedical entity that walks in the door. And by doing so, it actually builds trust that they might reveal the information that I need to make the diagnosis. But very often when you get good at this, and I have mentors who are way better than I am, even at this stage, they get the information that they need through that small talk. Rather than starting with like, please tell me your chronology of illness, they start saying, please tell me how you spend your day. And they weave into the illness as part of that person's life, and all the other relevant things fold into the story where they create a narrative. They say, Now I understand. They would have gotten to that sock thing on their best day, not on my day where I had extra time to kill. And so this framework that we use in our everyday life really works with patients as well, where you say relationship, then the task, and then the relationship. And to hardwire it, the action step here is to remember that, to put in some sort of structure when we're collecting data. Medicine is still a very data-intensive practice and intensive in terms of what we collect. But one way you can do this is by hardwiring it in some structure you use, whether it's the note you write, the conference that you lead, or the narration that happens between colleagues. So that the idea here is that a social history has nothing to do with those 6 important health-related behaviors, which are critically important. Smoking, drinking, drugs, nutrition, sexual activity, exercise, all of those important. They can be social or not, that's totally up to you. But what matters is none of those qualify as a social history. And the true social history, if I've never asked anyone about that, the forcing function is that box just stares blankly right at me. And if someone says something like, tell me about the patient, what I realize is I really don't know anything about the patient, or at least not them as a person. So the key action step, even when we have a diagnostic mystery, is to remember that don't think of the social history as the inquisition on smoking, drinking, and drugs. It's think about the world that they inhabit. And not only does it make the visit more pleasant, not only does it make the patient feel more cared for, it oftentimes is the secret sauce to breaking the case. Okay. Back to the cognitive stance. There's many stances you can take on problem solving and diagnosis, and one of them is just, if I can bring enough information into the room in my brain, maybe accompanied by the computer, I should be able to crack this case. I should be able to render a diagnosis. And I love that notion. That's what I spent a lot of my career sort of focusing on. But what I've learned from everything from secular trends in society to colleagues I work with is that oftentimes this is a really reductionist model. Like if it was just me, the computer, and the patient, that's all I need, because that's all we need in the room to solve the problem. And what is becoming increasingly clear, both with our broadening scope of how we pay attention, but also the things that we learn, is that we are not alone in the room. And oftentimes in that interaction between patient and doctor and technology, there's a lot of history going back decades and sometimes hundreds of years that is impacting the interaction that's happening in that moment. And they relate to things like trust and information sharing and willingness to exchange information. So what do I mean by that? We have come to recognize that some of the diagnostic tools that we have are biased. So some of the things that we rely on in terms of accurate information, whether that's measuring someone's kidney function using a formula called GFR, whether we measure oxygen levels through a machine called a pulse ox, which was critical in COVID. It was big in terms of triage decisions, can be imbalanced depending on the color of people's skin and their nails and their surrounding skin color, oftentimes working to the disadvantage of people who have darkened skin and darker skin and other things tools that we use. We recognize as we keep looking pulmonary function tests that there are more and more things that were not designed with equity in mind, but we've carried forward for decades, but lead to diagnostic inaccuracy. But those are easy to swallow because they feel like that's technological. There was a point in time when that mistake was happened, and maybe we can use technology to start all over and hit the reset button. But the one instrument that's a lot harder for many of us to recognize is that the most important instrument in the exam room is the instrument of our mind, and that is the ultimate measurement instrument, and that can be biased as well. My colleague Denise Conner has really shown this, and she did an amazing presentation at the American College of Physicians. She said, when we get in that room, we have social, cultural, and historical forces that are all bearing down on us, and we have a lot of work to do. Depending on someone's experience with the healthcare system, it could be because of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their language, any other orientation they have in life. They may have had bad experiences that predated this visit. It may be with society, it may have been with one security guard, it may have been with one receptionist, or it may have been with one doctor, but whatever it is, all of that is in play when we are in the room together trying to exchange information, build trust, and come to a diagnosis. And if we ignore that, we ignore it at our own peril because we're missing information. I can't do justice to this in 1 minute, let alone 1 hour, but suffice it to say we have a lot of work to do as individuals, as a health system, and even as a society to sort of undo all of those inequities that have happened in the past. But we do have to start somewhere as a clinician. I have learned from a lot of my great colleagues in this area, people like Kimberly Manning, Dr. Quinn Capers, Dr. Kimberly Manning, Dr. Denise Conner, all of these people who are working in the space and saying, well, where do we start? What do we do while we're trying to make society better? And one of them is to recognize that we are all susceptible to the phenomenon of in-group and out-group. As soon as you differ from me in any characteristic, any one of those ways that I mentioned before, my brain is less charitable to people in my out group. There's no way around it. If you are a 5'10" Indian guy in your late 40s who hails from Wisconsin and lives in San Francisco and has 2 boys, I'm just like, I'm like, you're me. Like, I'm hugging, I'm looking in the mirror. I'll do everything that I can to trust you, believe you, advocate for you, work on your side. And as soon as you change any one of those parameters, my human nature, which you all have as well, is to go a little less farther for that person, to believe that person a little less, to doubt them a little bit more. We would hate to admit it, but the studies show that that's a characteristic of all of us. So what can we do? Being aware of it, that it impairs our judgment, is the first start, but the real step is what can you do to bridge that gap? And with this issue of in-group and out-group, some of the doctors I mentioned here say as a starting point, this is not fixing society, but this is fixing my own behavior, is that you try to find a bridge. You go through the act of individualization and say, as many differences as I can see with another person, there's something I have in common with them. It may be we grew up in the same place, we like the same sports team, we went to the same high school, whatever it is, you find something that bridges the gap between the two of you. And you start to realize when you get practice in that, Dr. Kimberly Manning talks about, if you just keep asking enough questions of a person, you will find something that the two of you have in common, sort of your shared humanity and experience. And when that comes, the person starts to enjoy some of the benefits, including my cognitive benefits, of being in the in-group. So build that bridge with the other person, find the shared experience that you have. Don't do it just because of the warm fuzzies. Do it also because it improves our decision-making that that patient in front of us deserves to get to the right diagnosis. Things may look different, but if you look underneath the surface, we have a lot in common. All right. Implicit biases that I just mentioned there are hard for people to discuss, and that conversation is really only just starting in the last couple of years because of secular trends. But one that has been very popular to discuss has been the issue of cognitive biases. That has been on the radar screen for over 2 decades in medicine. It is oftentimes a favored entry point of people when they say, why do doctors make diagnostic errors and what can I address? It feels safer, it's more studied, but it's equally complex. And you'll see debates between great people. Here's Malcolm Gladwell, who in his book Blink says the brain is an amazing instrument. If you train it well enough, it can look at something in the short period of time and diagnose. And on the, sorry, your right, is Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate, who says the brain is fine, it's quite good, he's a cognitive psychologist, but it's a flawed instrument, and it's flawed in predictable ways. And we need to be aware of that in order to optimize our judgment. The biases and heuristics that came out of the work of Daniel Kahneman and many, many other people that follows are some of these. One is the concept of anchoring. As soon as I make a judgment, like I think this person has gout in their knee, I won't change my mind despite disconcerting evidence. There's the concept of the availability heuristic, which is the brain is not really good at making probabilistic assessments, but if something happened recently and it's really salient, like last week I missed meningitis in someone and then today they come in with a headache, my brain will wildly overestimate the probability that today's patient has meningitis. The news does the same thing. And then the issue of confirmation bias, which we hear about quite a bit, which is the brain is not an accurate surveyor of the world. Even if we say I'm going to do my own search, we tend to look for things that support our initial views on things. It's the way humans work. The challenge with this learning about these errors, which are actually quite seductive and they're quite demonstrable in the lab, is that it doesn't exactly describe just errors. So it turns out that we trot out that language to describe the decision-making process only when there's a bad outcome. But it turns out most of the time those same things, anchoring, confirmation, availability, work quite well, and they are the foundation of learning and doing better the next time we see something. So it's tricky to think about this, that language that we use to try to describe thinking is just lopsided. I'll give you an example from sports. Let's say a team is in a high-risk situation, they're at the end, the coach has to make a call about a play that's right on the margin, right? If they win, if they make this play, it's gonna be a big win. If they don't make the play, it's gonna be a huge loss. The coach will go through a decision-making process. She weighs all the pros and the cons. She's taking all her experience, her recent efforts at this, and she says, go for the play. That's the decision-making process. She's gone through this. If the team scores and gets the points, she will be hailed as a visionary coach, gutsy, brilliant, experienced, insightful, because of the decision-making process that she went through. If the team doesn't win, if they don't make the conversion, they don't cross the goal line, that same decision-making process will be called short-sighted, foolish, poor judgment. All of those same adjectives will be trod out. We have two different words because the human brain is not good at judging the decision-making process. It's only good at judging the outcome. And that vocabulary that we learn for the heuristics and biases only comes out when the things go wrong, even though the person's thinking was exactly logical and on point. Example from the ER where I work, if someone comes into the ER, they have terrible pain on their right flank, they have blood in their urine, they can't move around, I'll say, this sounds like a kidney stone. This is exactly what a kidney stone looks like. And someone will say, well, that's a good diagnostician. Then the CAT scan, which detects 98% of kidney stones, comes back and it says there's no kidney stone at all. And if I say, you know what, I still think this is a kidney stone, someone's going to look at him and be like, that guy, it's premature closure, that's confirmation bias. He just wants it to be a kidney stone. He's not adjusting his probability. And sure enough, I think that would be an accurate discussion or a label. You'd say, I'm just stuck on that. I haven't budged at all, despite disconcerting evidence. So that would be fair to say that's premature closure. That's confirmation bias. But if the patient walks in the next day and says, hey, doc, here's the kidney stone that you told me I'd have, and then they filtered it through their urine, then they'll turn to me and they'll be like, that guy is brilliant. That guy is an amazing diagnostician. Same judgment process, it's just the outcome draws a different label. And that is the problem, is that heuristics and biases, while they are features of our brain, they're taught and sometimes elevated as sort of a bug, but they're really a feature of the software. They're designed because more times than not, they are efficient ways of learning and getting things done. And the take home from this is that they are important to learn about, not necessarily as the target to intervene on, but to recognize that our thinking is flawed, and that we need to adopt strategies in other ways to optimize the way we reason through processes. Daniel Kahneman says this himself in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I recommend it. It's a marvelous book. He's a Nobel laureate. He's incredibly erudite in thinking about this. But even at the end of his 40-year career and his 400-page book, he just says this about all those heuristics and biases. He says, you know what? The truth is, I now can recognize a few situations where I'm getting better at recognizing when I might be at risk. But if I'm honest with you, I'm much better at seeing them in other people than I am in myself. And that has been the take home of that line of research, which has been informative, but not yet as actionable as we hoped. All right, a story about a veteran. Patient comes into the hospital. He's in really rough shape, brought in by ambulance. He has bleeding or ecchymosis all over. He's wasting away. His dentition is in rough shape. He has lab values that show very low blood counts, what we call anemia, and the workup begins. He has blood and you can see bruising all over his body. We wondered about endocarditis, which is an infection in the heart valve. We wondered whether there could be elderly abuse going on because he lived alone but was visited by someone on the younger side. We did workups for cancer by doing endoscopy where we put cameras inside and out. We did x-rays, ups and downs, CAT scan, trying to figure out what's going on with him. Hematology, rheumatology, everyone is on board. One day he has more bleeding into his thigh. We do a CAT scan that shows his body's bleeding for uncertain reasons, despite the blood tests being unrevealing. And we say, well, what do we do? So we're a couple days in, we're many thousands of dollars in. And then one day the nutritionist comes and finds us. We're outside pontificating about the many unusual and interesting diseases that might be possible. And the dietitian says, you know he had a bunch of stomach problems, right? We say, oh yeah, for sure. We put him on a PPI. That's a medicine that suppresses acid. We got that covered. Thanks for letting us know. And she's like, yeah, if you look at his tray, and we're like, yeah, we've seen his tray. She's like, if you look at his tray, you will see that he always leaves the fruits and vegetables. And she's like, why is that? She's like, oh, because that stomach thing, it tears up his stomach when he eats them, particularly fruits, particularly citrus fruits. So he always leaves them on his tray. He doesn't touch them forever. That's the only thing that keeps his stomach quiescent. And what we learned there was we didn't need another doctor, we didn't need another test, that we just needed someone, we needed another perspective. We needed someone who knew that what he had was not a modern ailment, but a medieval one that came from the age of sail, when ships, which used to just be able to cover a short distance, wound up being able to go months at sea for conquest or exploration or war. And the sailors couldn't take with them any perishable items, particularly vegetables or citrus. And so they would go out like this, but they would come back by this. And what was discovered then in short order and is known now was that the patient had scurvy, complete absence of vitamin C because they were never eating fruits and vegetables. And like I said, we could have done more tests, and we probably would have, but it was the insight of one practitioner, a non-physician, who told us what was happening. And it gets at the idea that we think about in diagnosis, which we have historically thought about it as a solitary act. That is to say, the lone physician is in charge of making this diagnosis, the captain of the ship mantra. And what we really need to move to is the idea of, instead of sort of the superhero, more of like a Hall of Justice approach. That you have a lot of people in this. And when you do this, and it takes practice for those of us who are socialized in another way, but when you recognize this, you start to learn that it's the nurse who learns that the asthma medicines aren't being taken, the pharmacist who recognize that this is a drug reaction, or the physical therapist who we think is just a sort of a weakened and aging person actually has new onset Parkinson's. And all of those I have been a party to. But what I didn't do is invite those people into the conversation. So when you tell doctors that we need to shift to a diagnostic team, many times what we say, oh yeah, I love it when the nurses point out something to me. I always listen to the nurses. Or I love it when the pharmacist will call me and tell me that an error is about to happen. But there's a difference between loving it and inviting it. And the action step is to think about whatever world you live in where there's a lot more talent than you can recognize around, and saying, do I wait for that talent to approach me, or do I invite that talent into the conversation? Because the move to a diagnostic team that goes beyond the doctor to other health professionals, and even beyond the health professionals to the patients and their families, is what is really need to tackle not only some of the toughest cases, but some of the most common ones. Okay. People remember in science and math class when you would turn in a problem set like this, it was very tough, you did hard work, you said, teacher, that's the question, here's the answer, and you only get 50% credit. What happened? You didn't show your work. And it turns out that that is a pernicious thing when it comes to reasoning. Oftentimes we jump right to the answer. And although it's unbeknownst to us, we feel like that's the job of reasoning, is getting to a right conclusion. It's not intellectually honest, but it's also not the best way to learn. You have to really show your work. The way this is conveyed is to switch from the idea of being a doctor and start to think about yourself as an attorney, being skilled in a court of law and making closing arguments. So we try to teach people that when you reach a diagnostic conclusion, it's not about the end point, it's about the journey. And we try to build this in structures. So for instance, when people present, we might say things like, I don't want you to say someone has shortness of breath and then tell me you think it's heart failure. I'm glad you got the answer right, but what I want to see is all your code. I want to see all the pathway that you took there. What's the way you think through the problem of dyspnea? List potential problems, and most importantly, be like an attorney. Make your closing arguments and show me the evidence for and against. It's a bit of a mind shift to say that the answer only gets half credit, but once you have this idea that you can really show your work, what you learn is that in there is all the brilliance and the opportunities to get better. So the action step, whether you're in the business of rendering a judgment or examining yours, is to make sure you externalize and share your diagnostic thinking. And one way for teachers to do this is move away from the thing that's very common in medicine, which is the idea of saying, I need you to put your nickel down. That's an invitation to say, tell me the one thing, and shift to a more welcoming, let me have a penny for your thoughts. A little bit of deflation, welcome in these times, but also an important stance. And the final point is this, and is the inspiration for the title of this talk, which is to think about all of these different perspectives we brought to bear. So I've used medical examples, but we're really talking about decision making. And if people want a bibliography, I don't have any academic articles, I just have 3 books I want to plug. The first is Thinking Fast and Slow, although it highlights biases and heuristics, which I said is not the answer. It is an amazing insight into both the successful function, but also the flawed cognition of our mind. If you are interested in the work of expertise, like what does the hard work look like in terms of becoming an expert in whatever field you're in, there's no better book than Anders Ericsson's Peak. There he elaborates the concept of deliberate practice, which is a very structured way of giving your mind and body increasing challenges, doing many reps, getting more feedback, and then going back for the next challenge. It sounds simple, but it's hard to design in life. He tells you how to do it. And then the last, and the inspiration for this talk, is Phil Tetlock's book, Super Forecasting. Super Forecasting is this amazing book that studies people in the Good Judgment Project. These are people who are asked to make judgments on political events in the world. You know, Will this country launch a nuclear missile? Will Canada invade the North Pole? Will COVID outbreak in South Africa? Will Pakistan and India reach an accord? Any geopolitical event you can imagine, people are betting and making judgments on. But the most amazing thing about this book is this, which is the best judgments come not from people who are experts, not people who have access to State Department or confidential information. It is a small subset of people, just 2% of people who are like the dragonfly. And these are called the super forecasters. They make judgments that are infinitely more accurate than the other 98% of people, ordering thousands that are in this competition and program. And what it is not their smarts, but they have an amazing habit of mind. So when Tetlock describes these super forecasters, he says they're like the dragonfly. So the dragonfly is this amazing insect. It's quite beautiful in some ways, unless you get too close. But one of the things it has as a feature is its eyes have up to 1,000 lenses. And each one of them gets information from a slightly different perspective. And then its brain is amazing at integrating them. And he says the super forecasters are basically like the dragonfly. Not only do they have 360 vision, but they have these habits. If they form a hypothesis, they don't treasure it, they test it. They're trolls, but not trolls like in the online sense of the word trolls. They're trolls like they look for the information that contradicts their opinion rather than reinforces their opinion. They adjust, but they don't waffle. They make very subtle adjustments. They know that if, this one thing happens, then I should just adjust a little bit. They don't switch from one category for the other. And the most thing is that unlike other people, they relish being wrong because they recognize that's an opportunity to be right later on. And this is really the inspiration for the title of the talk, and even I think my mindset that I have tried, and I'm still a work in progress for myself and other people, is to become a super forecaster. Diagnosis is super important for what we do for patients. It's the foundation of getting them better. But I want to make the point here that in doing that, diagnostics excellence is achievable. If you look here, this is sort of a menu of options that I presented. I wanted to share that I had always thought for a long time it was just about being smart. But now I recognize that's important, but that's not it. There are many, many ways to improve your thinking and cognition. What I don't want to convey to you here is that any of these things are easy. They're all hard work. If it wasn't hard work, all of us would do it. But I hope you get the message that in the realm of patient care, it's hard work, but it's definitely worth it. So I thank you so much for your time and attention, and I appreciate so much the invitation to join you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dhaliwal. Provocative indeed. Time for some questions or comments from the audience or online. And maybe I'll start if I could. At the very beginning, you talked about most intense learning. And
yes.
I couldn't help but think, as a neurobiologist myself, we learn about the role of stress, and we can take it right down to the biological level of stress hormones and how they bind to receptors in the brain. It can affect the activity of neural circuits and learning and memory. Mm-hmm. The take-home point from most of that research is a little bit of stress is a good thing. It actually increases performance. Mm-hmm. A lot of stress can be destructive to how our brains deal with things. So in the clinical setting, what I'm wondering when you talked about that, those intense periods, it seems like we go out of the way a lot of times to avoid putting people into very stressful situations. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about the patient here, I'm talking about
the learning environment, yeah.
Is there value added? I realize the stakes are the patient's diagnosis in life. So,
yeah.
But is there value added to put the clinician in the more stressful setting to really activate those circuits that allow you to get it right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought you were going in the teaching direction. So yeah, thinking about the doctor under stress, like, because I'm also more familiar with that stress enhances learning, and I'm trying to think of whether I also know that stress enhances real-time decision-making. That's what you're asking. Because I will just touch on the learning part, which I know a little better. There is a concept called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which basically shows it's an inverted U, and if you put a learning on the x-axis and stress on the y-axis, it's not a surprising curve, but it's an important one, that people who have no stress, if your teacher has zero expectations of you and there's no test and you just get to come and go whenever you want and no one cares what you say or do, people don't learn much. And then conversely, if you're in an incredibly stressful environment with excessive demands, no support, poor learning environment, you also don't learn. And there is a sweet spot in between where the sort of stress with care and guidance is what gets the optimal result. So I do know that in learning. I don't know the answer to how much that's been studied in the work environment or professional environment for decision making. The prime example might be things like closing the loop. Like for me to take care of my, to find out what happened to my patient using an economic term, this information search costs. Like it's very costly time-wise to learn what happened to my patient. I have to go through the electronic medical record. I have to hunt down other clinicians, et cetera. So either I wish technology would make that learning come to me, sort of a push instead of pull model, or that there would be more time baked into the day that says learning the craft is important even in the professional realm. It either comes right now with fundamentally an access cost or a reimbursement cost if you divert more time to learning on your own, right? It becomes a personal effort. Healthcare system is probably a much bigger egg to fry, but I guess my point would be some of these things, if they were baked into training, which also is packed to be fair, but the idea that like, stretch assignments are good and we should keep striving for them. You have that habit in training that we start asking about myths that we learn early on, like unlearning instead of carrying them forward. Like we propagate a lot of myths in medical education, partly because someone told that story a long time ago. Like, so those are ways that we could be improving. And then teamwork, which everyone says but doesn't practice, and I'm as guilty as anyone else. But those sort of things, if those would be some of the things I would put into the medical practice realm if I had a wand, I could do that.
Good question online. How do you know what information to unlearn? How do you know which information is wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and not to get into sort of like the stuff about COVID misinformation, which is just coming fast and furious, but a lot of the stuff that we need to unlearn is like patently obvious. Like it's written in many, many places or forms, and it just propagates because it's sociologically embedded. So if they say something like, there's so many examples, but someone says like, if someone has a penicillin allergy, you cannot give a cephalosporin antibiotic. Those are just two classes of antibiotics. Like that thing has been propagated forever since time immemorial. It's also been disproven like forever since time immemorial, but the bad news version of it it's a natural selection outwins. Or this idea I mentioned earlier that contrast is injurious to the kidneys. If it is, there's the most trivial signal known to man, but it impairs diagnostic testing throughout the United States. And it's proven and it's written about, it's out there, but it has a very strong social hold. And there's many other ones that are there. So I think I think the only time you would ever commit yourself to unlearning is when there's infinitely more data that tells you that. And you know that what you're really up against is sort of a social phenomenon, not a intellectual one. So it's a high bar, but not a bar that if you pay attention, you see it frequently. Or people point out to me. Like I think a lot of very smart people say that's a myth. Like we don't think that way anymore. And then I have to unlearn that myself.
Okay. Any other questions in the audience? Yep, go ahead and get a microphone so the people online can hear you as well.
Kind of following along question that she asked, but for future physicians, like we're currently medical students right now, and like exactly what you said about social history, we ask about alcohol, smoking, substance use, but I think in real clinical medicine, we are pressured to ask those questions and not necessarily get to know the real social history of the patient because of the time and the resources. So what advice would you have for future medical students to kind of fight against the health system's pressure to not really get to know the social history of the patients, or not spend like kind of resist that time crunch and the pressure to like maybe not spend so much time.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think let's say you're like my supervising physician or my supervising attending is not interested in any of that stuff, right? Just as an example, like they only want to know about smoking, drinking, or drugs or something. Those three things are relevant for healthcare, so it's not that you wouldn't ask about them. The other things that you do on your own, it's almost similar to many other forms of the presentation, like when you collect data from the patient, right? In a presentation or a note, only a fraction of it gets captured. So some of it is for rapport building, some of it is for diagnostic utility. But I would emphasize this, I think all those things take a lot of time when you first do it, right? So I think that list that I said, like, tell me about your day, tell me about your job, tell me about your family or whatever. It does seem like a long list, but it's actually no different than the physical exam that when you first do it takes a ton of time. And then if you keep practicing it, even though you only report a small amount of the physical exam, doing the whole comprehensive one you get good at. Unlike the physical exam, I think this one is much more, there's much more joy and comes in human connection that comes by doing that sort of in a complete and holistic way. So I totally get what you're saying, whether it's the electronic medical record doesn't care about any of that stuff, or my supervising physician doesn't care about any of that stuff. I mean, we operate in the real world, but I think you almost will recognize there's some rewards, and some of your big diagnostic breaks will come because you resisted what your attending told you and did it anyway. So stick with it. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think you can also look at it as investment in the patient.
100%.
Because the patient buys into your plan, and will take your advice better if you've built that rapport. So it's not just about making the diagnosis, it's about making them better.
Yeah.
You know,
I really like that notion. That's beautifully said. There's so many benefits downstream from just like the raw data. Like I said, it's not just good manners, it's really like good medicine. And there may be some other form that you're really glad you did that, or they are.
Great. Please join me in thanking Dr. Dhaliwal.
Thank you, everyone.